You're watching the C-Spine Show. I'm Dr. Craig Callewart. Please like, follow, and subscribe. My family has always been involved in agriculture. My father's father was a farmer, mostly corn, and my father always told me that he made enough money farming during World War II when prices were very high that he could afford to go to medical school. Couldn't get all the way through medical school, but with the Korean War and the GI Bill, he was able to then cover expenses and trained in San Antonio, and that's how my family relocated to Texas, was because of the Korean War in the 50s. And then his sister was a dairy farmer. She had a dairy, but also pigs and chickens, and grew all the usual agricultural things to support livestock. So livestock and farming is just, that's in my blood. I've always gardened, and I enjoy gardening. But that world intersected with another world in the early 90s when the federal government decided that Texas had too many cattle. And Texas being 97% privately owned, pretty much said, sorry, we're not like the western third of the country. We're not mostly government owned. We've been a sovereign nation. You know, you can have your regulations, but they don't apply to us. So at that time, there was a governor of Texas who was not of that mindset. And she decided she would support the feds by saying that there was a small bird that is not native to Texas, that nested in trees that are not native to Texas, that most of us in farming and ranching would like to remove from our pastures because they take a lot of water and they do various things to the land that are not good for raising grass. And grass is Texas' largest agricultural crop. Paradoxically, there was a program going on throughout the Southwest to eliminate these non-native species. But, twist of things, those in Washington who wanted to regulate cattle production in Texas, again, decided that that program really should not exist anymore, and we should be preserving these trees that previously we had been encouraged and occasionally paid to remove. So that got under the skin of many in Texas, that the feds were trying to say how many cattle per acre, and as a way to make that happen, limited the type of brush that could remove. And again, this is the 90s, so the technology wasn't that good, but the feds were releasing satellite photos of our land that could differentiate a evergreen tree from a tree that loses its leaves during the winter. And that was one way they could tell the vegetation we had on our ground. So my family actually went down to Austin to protest. And that was a planned protest. It caught a lot of national attention. First time I'd ever been to Austin for a legislative matter. And it actually started to reverse that policy. It wasn't until that particular governor left office that the policy was completely dropped. But that made me realize how powerful the people can be if they choose to organize and exert themselves, which then led me more into the legislative arena, because healthcare obviously consumes quite a bit of the nation's gross domestic product. It also takes a large number of tax dollars, and by some estimates, roughly half the healthcare delivered in the United States is through our tax dollars. Half the babies born in Texas are born not through payment by private insurance, but through tax dollars. So the government's very involved in healthcare, and unfortunately, very few physicians are. So anyway, I became active through the Texas Medical Association and the Texas Orthopedic Association, and made it a point to go to Austin a couple times every session. Then began doing it in Washington, but what I quickly realized was there's a big difference between Austin and Washington, at least back then. Probably the biggest difference is our Austin lawmakers meet once every 2 years for roughly 140 days to decide how the budget's spent and laws that are associated with it, and then they leave Austin and go back to work. Very different than Washington, where once you're elected, you're there for life, or at least a very long time, and you don't go back to your communities, and you don't go back to work other than visit. Again, I'm speaking in generalities, but it is a very different mentality set. So I became active in our state legislature as a liaison, which in layman's terms I would say is an unpaid lobbyist. So I would call upon the legislatures, both in my district and other districts, and tell them how organized medicine feels about certain matters, or how I, as a private physician, feel about certain matters. And over a period of decades, I've become a respected source for many because I've been down there so long, and I'm not actually selling a product, and I don't work for a hospital system or an insurance system or a government entity. I do this out of duty. So that led to this week's happening, which was a caucus here in Dallas that I was going to speak for a period of time about health care. And again, I'm not a policy wonk, reasonably smart guy, try to stay on top of the issues. But the reason they want to talk to me is they flat out say, we do things in the Beltway that make sense on paper, and we have all kinds of analysts to tell us how this will be good for the country. But at the end of the day, we kind of need to hear what's happening in our own districts and other local districts and how it's actually affecting the practice of medicine at the local level. And so that's really what I bring to the table, is say, look, when you do X, Y, and Z, when you cut Medicare payments by this amount, I can't send patients to a rehabilitation hospital after surgery, or I can't use the newest technology on the patient because there isn't a budget for it. And the newest technology is not always the way to go. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But these decisions that are being made in Washington are well-meaning, and with the idea of trying to help the most people with limited dollars, but sometimes they have unintended consequences. So that's what I contribute to the table. So I was all ready to go yesterday for this meeting, and we had congressmen flying in from around the country. And then the budget battle happened, and Speaker Johnson decided, after holding for a period of time on this piece of legislation, he was going to call a vote. And so, better or worse, it happened yesterday. Our caucus was canceled. I am deflated, but I'm also happy that our congressional leaders have got funding set for the rest of the fiscal year. So I'm sorry to those of you who tuned in and didn't see us yesterday, but we were gathered together trying to help the process. You're watching the C-Spine Show. I'm Dr. Craig Callewart. Please like, follow, and subscribe. One of the matters I talk about that seems to get the most traction is the cost of health care. And most of our elected are not in health care. They're attorneys. In Congress we have, I believe, a half dozen between the House and the Senate who are physicians. So it's mostly attorneys trying to make decisions based on health care. And one of the most surprising facts that I delivered to them is that the physician payment component of the overall health care spending is somewhere around 5 to 7%. That is 5 to 7% of what is spent on health care is going to the workers, to the physicians, and then even a smaller amount going into the nursing and technicians. So a lot of attention has been paid to healthcare professionals in terms of trying to get a grip on spending, and I'm sure it needs some attention, but what is really becoming out of control, and this is widely covered by the media, are pharmaceuticals. And I personally, on two medicines whose retail value is $1,500 a month, and that's just crazy. And I understand that it is expensive to develop some of these medicines, and some of these medicines really are miraculous, particularly in the way they were developed. The technology is nothing short of phenomenal. It's certainly not anything I could have even envisioned in medical school, and that is expensive. It's expensive to do that. But at the same time, if we're getting to the point where the population can't afford it, that's not going to work either. And I commonly tell legislators who are listening to me, look, I'm paid roughly half of what I was 20 years ago, and even less when you consider 30 years ago when I started practice, yet my insurance premiums have gone up fivefold. So there's some kind of disconnect here. Pharmacy is one of them. And there's no easy solution to this, but there still are some boundaries and breaks that can be applied to start saving money. The other thing that people just don't want to talk about is end of life. And again, 80% of our healthcare dollars, maybe 60%, depending on what statistics you want to pick, are spent on the last couple months of life. And that's difficult to talk about, but in my trauma days where we have 24 ICU beds, it was not uncommon to have a third of the people that are basically dead. That is very little natural bodily function. So they are being mechanically supported by ventilators. They are on medications through their IV that makes their heart pump. They are having all kinds of what I would call heroic measures to keep their life going. And in part, it's because everybody wants to do whatever they can to keep a person alive. But at some point, we have to say this is a triumph of technology over reason. And that's very difficult to occur within a family. And I've seen this in my own family, particularly those who are in medicine. So we've got to figure out some process where independent physicians can look at a case and say there is no reason to continue to support this person who is basically clinically dead. And I helped participate in that legislation where Texas put together a way for hospitals to start limiting care on those who are terminally ill or, as we would say, clinically dead. And that's something that needs to happen on a state level because a lot of dollars are being spent that way and not spent well. The reason I particularly became involved in that discussion was, again, I'm doing trauma. I've got 24 ICU beds. I've got 3 or 4 laying in the emergency room who are living, who really need to be in the ICU, but I've got 7 clinically dead people who really we need to stop the life support on. And again, very touchy issue. I've seen people come back to life who I thought really had very little or no chance. So, but at the same time, we have to understand there's a limited number of resources and use those appropriately, just like my colleagues in military training are taught to do. What was interesting to me is one of the nurses I worked with, this would be the first Iraqi war, he was trained to go out and assess battlefield casualties. And he knew before the start of the firefight how many units of blood were available in the mobile army unit that was a few miles behind the line. And so he had different colored tags. And so he would look at the casualties and tag somebody injured and make an assessment of how many units of blood it was going to cost to potentially save this soldier's life. So again, the military has figured out how to triage, and some of those same techniques need to be brought into the civilian life. Once again, I'm able to articulate this to our legislator because I'm not a government individual. I'm not selling a product. I don't work for an insurance company. I don't work for a hospital system. I'm just doing this as an ordinary citizen. So those are the kinds of things I was going to talk a little bit about before the congressional budget fight flared up again. Thank you for watching the C-Spine Show. A new show is uploaded at 9 p.m. every Wednesday.